Sarah Martinez felt her heart stop beating as she recognized the man in seat 12A. The same cold blue eyes that had stared back at her from the courtroom 3 years ago. The same thin lips that had mumbled a half-hearted apology before walking free with just a suspended sentence for killing her little sister Emma in a drunk driving accident. Before we continue with Sarah's heart-wrenching story of confronting her sister's killer at 35,000 feet, let us know from where you are watching from in the comment below, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now, as Sarah stood frozen in the airplane aisle with her serving tray trembling in her hands, she watched him casually flip through a magazine as if he hadn't destroyed an entire family, as if Emma's bright laugh and dreams of becoming a teacher meant nothing at all. And Sarah's mind raced back to that terrible night when the police officer had knocked on their door at 2 a.m. to tell them that 22-year-old Emma had been crossing the street after a shift at the hospital where she worked. As a nurse, when Marcus Rivera, drunk off his mind with a blood alcohol level twice the legal limit, had plowed his BMW straight into her, leaving her broken body on the cold asphalt while he stumbled out of his car more worried about the damage to his precious vehicle than the life he had just taken. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she was now supposed to serve this monster coffee and peanuts with a professional smile, to ask him if he needed anything, to treat him like any other passenger when all she wanted to do was scream at him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain her family had endured watching Emma fight for her life in the ICU for 6 agonizing days before the machines finally went silent. Marcus looked exactly the same except for a few more lines around his eyes, still wearing expensive clothes that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month, still carrying himself with that entitled arrogance that had made her want to leap across the courtroom and strangle him when his lawyer argued that a promising young businessman shouldn't have his life ruined over one mistake, as if Emma's life was worth less than his career prospects. Sarah's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the tray as she remembered sitting in that sterile courtroom listening to Marcus's sob story about his drinking problem and his promise to get help, watching the judge buy into his crocodile tears and wealthy family connections, feeling her world collapse when he walked out of that courthouse a free man while Emma lay cold in the ground. The other flight attendants noticed something was wrong with Sarah, her usual warm demeanor replaced by a pale, distant look that made her colleague Jessica ask if she was feeling sick, but Sarah couldn't explain that the man who had murdered her sister was sitting in first class acting like he deserved to be treated like royalty. As the Boeing 737 climbed to cruising altitude, Sarah found herself walking past Marcus's seat over and over again, each time catching glimpses of his manicured hands. The same hands that had gripped a steering wheel while drunk, the same hands that had taken a precious life and walked away virtually unpunished, and she wondered if he even remembered Emma's name or if she was just another faceless victim in his privileged life. The turbulence started as a gentle bump that barely registered with the passengers, but Sarah felt it in her bones like a dark omen, a sign that this flight was going to be different from any other, that the universe was putting her and Marcus Rivera together 35,000 feet above the ground for a reason she couldn't yet understand. Marcus pressed his call button, and Sarah's blood turned to ice when she realized she would have to face him, to look into those cold eyes that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years, to pretend she didn't know who he was while her heart screamed for justice. "Excuse me, miss," Marcus said in that same smooth voice that had charmed the judge and jury. "Could I get another scotch on the rocks?" And Sarah wanted to tell him that he'd had enough alcohol for several lifetimes, that every drop he'd ever consumed was tainted with Emma's blood, but instead she nodded and walked away on unsteady legs to get his drink. The turbulence grew stronger as Sarah poured the amber liquid into a plastic cup, her hands shaking so violently that she spilled some on the galley counter, and she stared at the golden puddle, thinking about how alcohol had been the weapon that killed her sister just as surely as a gun or knife would have been. When she returned with his drink, Marcus didn't even look up from his magazine, didn't say thank you, treating her like invisible hired help, and Sarah realized with growing rage that he probably didn't even remember the trial, didn't remember Emma's name, didn't care about the family he had destroyed because wealthy people like him never faced real consequences for their actions. The airplane suddenly dropped what felt like 100 feet, causing passengers to gasp and grab their armrests. And Sarah had to steady herself against Marcus's seat, her hand accidentally brushing his shoulder, and the contact made her skin crawl as she remembered Emma's cold hand in the hospital, how she had held it and begged her sister to wake up, to give them one more chance to say goodbye properly. "Looks like we're in for a rough ride," Marcus commented casually, finally looking up at Sarah with those same blue eyes that had shown no remorse in the courtroom. And she wanted to tell him that he had no idea what a rough ride really meant, that losing your sister to a drunk driver was the kind of turbulence that never ended, that shook your entire world and left you permanently damaged. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing severe weather ahead and instructing all flight attendants to take their seats immediately. But Sarah couldn't move, couldn't stop staring at the man who had stolen Emma's future, who had walked free while her family lived with a life sentence of grief and rage. Another violent jolt threw Sarah sideways, and she caught herself on Marcus's armrest, finding herself face to face with her sister's killer, close enough to smell his expensive cologne, to see the little scar on his chin that she remembered for the trial photos. And for a moment, she forgot to breathe as 3 years of suppressed fury rose in her throat like bile. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked with what might have been genuine concern. And Sarah almost laughed at the bitter irony of Emma's killer showing more care for a stranger's well-being than he had ever shown for the life he took. But she managed to straighten up and mumble something about being fine, even though she felt like she was falling apart from the inside out. The turbulence became so severe that several passengers started crying and praying. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like yellow flowers of death. And through it all, Marcus sat calmly, sipping his scotch, as if violent storms were just minor inconveniences in his privileged life. And Sarah wondered if anything could ever shake his cold composure, if he was even capable of feeling fear or regret. She should have gone to her jump seat like the captain ordered, but Sarah found herself moving closer to Marcus instead, drawn by a force she couldn't explain, perhaps the same cosmic justice that had put them both on this airplane together in the middle of a terrifying storm. Sarah remembered Emma's last words to her, spoken over the phone just hours before the accident, how her sister had called to tell her about a little boy in the pediatric ward who had asked if angels wore scrubs like Emma did, and how Emma had laughed that beautiful laugh that Sarah would never hear again, saying that if angels existed, they probably did wear scrubs because there was no job more important than taking care of people when they were scared and hurting. The memory hit Sarah like a physical blow as she watched Marcus calmly sip his drink. This man who had silenced Emma's laughter forever, who had stolen all the lives she would have saved, all the children she would have comforted, all the families she would have helped through their darkest moments. "Do you ever think about the people you've hurt?" Sarah heard herself asking, her voice barely audible over the groaning of the aircraft as it fought against the violent wind. And Marcus looked up with confusion in his blue eyes, not understanding the question or recognizing the woman whose family he had destroyed. The airplane pitched forward so sharply that several passengers screamed, and Sarah was thrown into the empty seat next to Marcus, suddenly close enough to grab him, to shake him, to make him understand what he had done to her family, and she felt a dangerous electricity in her fingertips as she imagined wrapping them around his throat. The storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos in Sarah's heart, lightning illuminating the dark clouds like flashes of her memories. Emma's graduation from nursing school, her first day at the hospital, the way she used to practice taking blood pressure on Sarah's arm until she got it perfect, her dreams of traveling to remote villages to help people who had no access to medical care. All of those dreams died on a rain-soaked street 3 years ago because the man sitting next to her now had been too selfish and entitled to call a taxi instead of getting behind the wheel after drinking enough alcohol to kill a horse. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Marcus asked, having to shout over the sound of the storm battering the aircraft. And Sarah realized this might be her only chance to confront him, to make him remember Emma's name, to force him to acknowledge the destruction he had caused before they potentially died together in this aluminum coffin hurtling through the darkness. The plane lurched violently to the left, throwing both of them against the window, and Sarah found herself pressed against Marcus, breathing the same air as her sister's killer, feeling his heart beating when Emma's had been stopped forever by his reckless choices. 3 years ago, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger despite the chaos around them. You killed a 22-year-old nurse named Emma Martinez, and you walked away with a slap on the wrist because your daddy's money bought you the best lawyer in the state. Marcus's face went white as recognition dawned, his scotch forgotten as he stared at Sarah with growing horror, finally understanding that this wasn't a random encounter but a confrontation he had probably dreaded for years, and she saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been fear or shame or both. The expensive watch on his wrist caught the emergency lighting, and Sarah remembered how the prosecutor had mentioned that Marcus had been at a charity gala that night, surrounded by other wealthy socialites who praised him for his philanthropy while he drank champagne and planned to drive home drunk, never thinking about the innocent people he might encounter on his journey. "You're Emma's sister," he whispered, and hearing him say her name after all this time hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming that he did remember that Emma wasn't just a forgotten victim, but a real person whose death had haunted him enough to recognize her family. The airplane shuddered and groaned around them like a dying beast, passengers sobbing and praying as they prepared for what might be their final moments. But Sarah felt strangely calm now that she was finally face to face with her sister's killer, finally able to say the words that had been burning inside her for 3 years. She thought about her parents, how her father had aged 10 years in the months after Emma's death, how her mother had stopped cooking Emma's favorite meals and couldn't bear to hear her name spoken aloud, how the whole family had been shattered into pieces that never quite fit back together the same way. She was going to be a pediatric nurse, Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the storm like a blade. She volunteered at the children's hospital on weekends, reading stories to sick kids, making them laugh when they were scared, and you took all of that away because you were too selfish and entitled to call a cab instead of driving drunk. Marcus opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out, his arrogant facade cracking under the weight of Sarah's pain and the terror of their situation. And for the first time since the trial, Sarah saw something human in his eyes, something that might have been genuine remorse. The plane dropped again, this time feeling like they were falling through space, and Sarah heard a woman behind them praying in Spanish, the same prayers her grandmother had taught Emma when she was little, the same prayers they had whispered in the hospital as they watched the machines keeping Emma alive, hoping for a miracle that never came. I think about her every day," Marcus finally managed to say, his voice breaking as another violent jolt threw them both against their seats, and Sarah wasn't sure if he was telling the truth or just saying what he thought she wanted to hear, but something in his tone made her believe him. The emergency oxygen masks dangled around them like nooses, swaying with each movement of the aircraft, and Sarah wondered if this was how Emma had felt in those final moments, if she had been afraid, if she had thought about her family, if she had forgiven the man who was about to kill her. "You think about her?" Sarah laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face as the airplane continued its violent dance with death. "You think about her while you're living your perfect life, making money, going on vacation, doing all the things she'll never get to do, because you stole her future?" The lights flickered and went out for a terrifying moment, plunging them into darkness broken only by the occasional flash of lightning outside the windows. And in that brief blackness, Sarah felt Emma's presence so strongly it took her breath away, as if her sister was there with them in their moment of judgment. She remembered Emma's voice, always so gentle and patient, how she used to talk Sarah through panic attacks during nursing school, how she would make hot chocolate and sit up all night helping her study for exams, how she believed that every person deserved compassion and understanding, even the ones who made terrible mistakes. When the emergency lighting came on, casting everything in an eerie red glow, Sarah saw that Marcus was crying, actual tears streaming down his face as he struggled with his seatbelt like he wanted to run away, but had nowhere to go at 35,000 feet in the middle of a storm. The red light made everything look like a scene from hell, and Sarah wondered if this was their punishment, if they were meant to confront their demons together while hurtling through the sky, trapped in a metal tube with nowhere to hide from their pain and guilt. "I wanted to come to the funeral," Marcus said suddenly, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I wanted to tell your family how sorry I was, how I'd give anything to trade places with her, but my lawyer said it would be admitting guilt, that it could affect the case, and I was a coward who listened to him instead of doing what was right." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of rage she had carried for so long. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that Marcus was human after all, flawed and broken and haunted by his actions in ways she had never imagined. She thought about Emma's funeral, how hundreds of people had come to say goodbye, patients she had cared for, doctors and nurses who respected her, children from the hospital who drew pictures of angels that looked like Emma, and how through all of that outpouring of love, Sarah had wondered why the man responsible for her death wasn't there to see the impact of what he had done. She was afraid of flying, Sarah found herself saying, the words coming from some deep place she didn't know existed. Emma was terrified of turbulence, said it felt like the world was ending, and I always teased her about it, told her she was being dramatic, but now I think maybe she could sense something, maybe she knew her time was going to be cut short. The airplane dropped again, this time feeling like they were in free fall, and several passengers screamed in terror. But Sarah and Marcus were locked in their own private world of pain and confession, two broken souls hurtling through the storm together. The turbulence seemed to ease for a moment, giving them a brief respite from the chaos. And in that relative calm, Sarah could hear other passengers crying softly, whispering to loved ones over the phone, telling them they loved them in case these were their final words. "What can I do?" Marcus asked desperately, grabbing Sarah's arm with shaking hands. "Tell me what I can do to make this right. I have money. I can donate to hospitals, start a foundation in her name, anything to honor her memory." Sarah looked at this man who had haunted her nightmares, who had walked free while her family suffered, and realized that his wealth and privilege hadn't protected him from the prison of his own guilt, that he had been serving his own kind of life sentence all along. She thought about all the nights she had lain awake planning what she would say to him if she ever saw him again, all the angry words she had rehearsed, all the ways she had imagined making him pay for what he had done, but none of those fantasies had prepared her for this moment of seeing him broken and desperate for redemption. The storm outside seemed to quiet slightly, as if nature itself was listening to their conversation, waiting to see how this confrontation would end, whether it would bring more destruction or the possibility of healing. "Emma forgave everyone," Sarah said quietly, remembering her sister's gentle nature, how she never held grudges, how she saw the good in people even when they disappointed her. She would have forgiven you too, probably already has wherever she is now. The words surprised Sarah as much as they seemed to surprise Marcus, because she hadn't planned to offer forgiveness, hadn't thought she was capable of it. But something about being trapped in this airplane with death as a possibility made her see things differently, made her understand that hatred was a burden that hurt her more than it could ever hurt him. The turbulence began to ease slightly, the airplane's violent shaking settling into a more manageable rhythm, and Sarah could hear the captain's voice over the intercom explaining that they were through the worst of the storm, that they would be making an emergency landing in Denver as a precaution. "I don't deserve forgiveness," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "I took a life, destroyed a family, and walked away like it didn't matter, like she didn't matter, and I've been living with that shame every single day since." Sarah felt the tight knot in her chest loosen a little more. Not because Marcus deserved her forgiveness, but because Emma would have wanted her to find peace, to stop carrying so much anger that it was poisoning her own life. She remembered how Emma used to say that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, how she believed that forgiveness was something you did for yourself, not for the person who hurt you. Emma believed in second chances, Sarah said, thinking of all the troubled patient her sister had cared for, how she never gave up on anyone. She would want you to do something meaningful with the life you still have, to make sure her death counted for something more than just your guilt. As the airplane began its descent toward Denver, Sarah felt a strange sense of closure. Not the violent confrontation she had fantasized about for 3 years, but something deeper and more healing. A recognition that hatred was a burden that hurt her more than it could ever hurt Marcus. The lights came back on fully, and the normal sounds of the aircraft returned. But Sarah knew that nothing would ever be normal again, that this flight had changed both of them in ways they were only beginning to understand. She looked around at the other passengers, some still crying, some laughing with relief, some holding hands with strangers they had bonded with during their shared terror. And she realized that trauma had a way of breaking down the walls between people, of revealing what really mattered when everything else was stripped away. "There's a scholarship fund," Sarah said suddenly, surprising herself. "The Emma Martinez Memorial Scholarship for nursing students. We started it with donations from her friends and coworkers, but it's small. We can only help one student a year." Marcus looked up with something like hope in his eyes, and Sarah realized that maybe this was why they had been brought together on this airplane. Not for revenge, but for redemption. Not to destroy, but to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The plane touched down in Denver with a gentle bump that seemed miraculous after the violence of the storm. And as they taxied to the gate, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying, a burden of hatred that had been slowly killing her from the inside out. "I want to fund it," Marcus said immediately. "I want to make it big enough to help dozens of students, hundreds. I want Emma's name to mean something, to help people the way she would have helped them if she had lived." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah found herself believing that this broken man sitting next to her might actually be capable of doing something good with his guilt, of turning his shame into something that could honor Emma's memory in a way that no court sentence ever could. "This doesn't make us even," Sarah said as they prepared to disembark. "Nothing can bring Emma back or erase what happened, but maybe it's a start. Maybe it's what she would have wanted." Marcus nodded, understanding that forgiveness wasn't something he could earn or buy, but a gift that Sarah was choosing to give. Not for his sake, but for her own healing and in memory of a sister who believed in the power of love over hate. As the passengers around them gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the aircraft, Sarah felt Emma's presence one last time. A warm feeling of approval and love that told her she had made the right choice, that her sister's spirit lived on not in anger and vengeance, but in compassion and the hope that even the worst mistakes could be transformed into something meaningful. The flight attendants were helping passengers evacuate, and Jessica appeared at Sarah's side with concern in her eyes, asking if she was okay, if she needed medical attention. But Sarah just smiled and said she was fine, better than she had been in years, actually. As they walked off the airplane together, Marcus fumbling for his business card and promising to call the scholarship fund the next day, Sarah felt the turbulence finally ending, both in the sky and in her heart. And as she watched Marcus disappear into the crowd of passengers, she knew that while justice might not always come in the form we expect, sometimes it comes in the form of a second chance to choose love over hate, forgiveness over revenge, and hope over despair. And that maybe, just maybe, Emma was somewhere smiling at the sister who had finally learned to let go of the storm and find peace in the calm that followed.